Good afternoon, and welcome to the first lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum Summer Series. I'm thrilled to have our author here with us today. I think you'll enjoy this lecture. The book was wonderful. Before I introduce him, I want to cover the usual housekeeping items. Uh, First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless of your method, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 20 or so, 30 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated, but certainly not expected. There is a donate tab on the website. Third, we have a social media channel. As I indicated, this talk is being recorded for that and will be posted shortly thereafter. You can access the channel at the icon at the top of the website, the little YouTube icon. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now to our speaker. Alan Allport is the author of Advanced Britannia, the epic story of World War II, 1942 through 1945. Alan is a British-born historian, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society who specializes in the British role in World War II. He received a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is currently the Dr. Walter Montgomery and Marion Gruber Professor of History in the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He is the author of Britain at Bay, the epic story of the Second World War, 1938 to 1941, which won the Historical Writers Association Nonfiction Crown Award. Demobbed, Coming Home After the Second World War, winner of the Longman History Today Book Prize, and Browned Off and Bloody Minded, The British Soldier Goes to War, 39 through 45. He currently lives in Syracuse, and as you can see, he's a phenomenal and accomplished World War II historian. I won't embarrass him by reading him all the reviews from Advanced Britannia, but I'll just select Paul Kennedy's, no stranger to this audience. In only a few volumes, Alan Allport has become the historian of Britain at war. This is no light accomplishment, since many good volumes have already told the story, but I think this is one of the best. Allport's command of his sources is remarkable, and the bibliography is vast. At the same time, the author's easy way with an anecdote makes reading Advanced Britannia effortlessly pleasant. A splendid example of how to do a fully rounded work on a people at total war, of how to use a vast mix of sources and to keep the story going. I certainly couldn't have said it better myself, and with that, I will turn it over to Alan, and I will be driving the slides. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg, and hello everybody, and thank you for coming to hear me today. Just before I start, I will say that I'm broadcasting from my office in Syracuse, New York, and it's rather sweltery today. So if I've kept the office door open for that reason. So if for some reason we start to get some noise, you'll forgive me if I quickly get up in order to close the door. But as you can see from my slide title here, I've called what I'm going to do today 6 things you probably didn't know about Britain's war 1942 to 1945. And I've decided to do it in this form rather than give you a just sort of conventional narrative account of what actually happened between those years. Because I thought that I would structure this in the form of 6 correctives. 6 places where the received story tends to be either wrong or at least badly incomplete. And some of these might be surprising. I hope indeed that some of them are surprising. Some of them may indeed be controversial. But each of them, as I hope I can show you, connects to something genuinely important about what Britain went through in the Second World War and why it matters. So, Greg, could you start with the first of the slides, please? Great. Okay, so the first one, as you can see, is that Pearl Harbor was a very mixed blessing for the British. Let me explain what I mean by that. So you see there on the bottom left, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And when the news reached Churchill in London on the evening of December the 7th, 1941, of the Japanese attack on the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, his reaction, as he admitted frankly, in his memoirs later, was one of barely concealed joy. He described it in his war memoirs in terms that have become famous. After Dunkirk, after the fall of France in 1940, after 17 months of Britain and the British Commonwealth's lonely fighting against the Germans, they had, he thought, won the war. Hitler's fate was sealed, Mussolini's fate was sealed, and as for the Japanese, Churchill said they would be ground to powder. And he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved. Now, you can understand why Churchill might have felt this way. Britain had been fighting alone since June 1940, and the strain on the British Empire had been immense. Now, the most powerful industrial nation on earth had been dragged in. And the fundamental question, would Britain survive the war at all, had probably been answered. But nonetheless, the famous words that I have just quoted from Churchill's memoirs were written with half a decade's hindsight. Now, at the time, however, in December 1941 itself, the inevitability of victory was perhaps less than obvious. And the immediate consequences of Pearl Harbor for Britain were, in many respects, actually disastrous. Churchill, of course, had always wanted the United States to enter the war, but he didn't want the United States to enter the war on these terms. He had been working ever since 1940 towards a situation where the United States would be drawn in through a confrontation with Germany, in particular in some kind of confrontation in the Atlantic. Instead, the United States had entered the war through the Pacific. And there would be, of course, as a result of the Japanese attack, a massive popular demand for revenge against Japan, which meant that the Europe first strategy Churchill had always strongly advocated, in other words, a grand strategy of the Western Allies to defeat Germany and Italy in Europe first, and only then to consider other possible enemies such as the Japanese in the Pacific. That was going to have to be argued for diplomatically in the weeks and months that followed. It wasn't something that could be completely taken for granted any longer. And for Britain, some of the difficulties that were created by America's entry into the war were very immediate. So on the night of December the 8th, in other words, the night after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States suspended all Lend-Lease transfers to Britain. Lend-Lease, of course, had been the act that had been passed in the late spring of 1941, which essentially allowed the transfer of war materials to Britain and the British Commonwealth, and then later the Soviet Union, without having to settle accounts there and then. In other words, it relieved the British of this enormous burden of having to pay for war materials using hard currency or gold, something that was becoming increasingly difficult by 1941. But all of this now was suspended. Lend-Lease transfers were suspended, and within a few days of Pearl Harbor, 12,000 railroad carriages full of supplies were piling up alongside the quays of New York Harbor. The dockside authorities forbidden to load them onto ships. Churchill had to rush to Washington within weeks just to ensure that the Lend-Lease program would continue at all. The issue wasn't resolved until New Year's Day 1942. And even when the supply flows resumed, the mix had changed. Previously, American dockyards had been building merchant shipping primarily to replace British vessels that had been lost to U-boats. Now, the US services appropriated the great majority of that new fleet for themselves. So the point being that while the United States had been as Roosevelt called it, simply the arsenal of democracy fighting against the Axis powers, Britain had largely had the luxury of receiving Lend-Lease supplies without having to worry too much about what the American military itself would want. But now that the United States was actually a combatant power, first place, of course, in the supply priority list, as far as the Americans were concerned, would go to the United States military, and Britain would very much have to accept the fact that it was now going to be in second place. Then, of course, there were the military catastrophes that soon took place in the Far East as well. Britain was now going to have to fight not just in Europe and the Mediterranean, but also in Southeast Asia, in a place that they were not well prepared to fight. So within a couple of days of Pearl Harbor, Britain suffered its own sort of Pearl Harbor when two of its battleships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were sunk off the east coast of Malaya by Japanese torpedo bombs. Then the Crown Colony of Hong Kong fell, actually on Christmas Day, 1941. Soon after, the colony of Malaya and the island of Singapore, which was regarded as the Gibraltar of the East, fell in February of 1942. 80,000 troops having to surrender to a Japanese force about half that size. Churchill, quite rightly, I think, called this one of the worst disasters in British military history. Burma, Crown Colony Burma, soon fell as well, putting Japanese troops on the borders of India. And parts of the Indian Ocean effectively became a Japanese lake by the spring of 1942. There was also, I think, in Britain, an emotional undercurrent that is perhaps out of politeness rarely mentioned any longer. So there was an organization, a government organization called Home Intelligence, which monitored morale and public opinion in the war. And it noted in December of 1941 a certain amount of what it called, quote, malicious glee, unquote, in Britain at the news of Pearl Harbor, which perhaps needs to be explained. Remember that the British had spent the previous year aware of the fact that while they were being bombed, while the Blitz was going on against London and other British cities, Americans were sitting thousands of miles away safely in their own firesides, listening to accounts of this on the radio. Now it seemed it was the Yanks, for a change, who were having to scamper to the air raid shelters, and perhaps there was a touch of Schadenfreude about the British response. So, yes, Pearl Harbor meant ultimately that the Allies were going to win the war. But as the British politician Harold Nicolson wrote in his diary, when Germany declared war on America on December the 11th, an event which, of course, from the British point of view, should have provoked an enormous amount of exultation. This was everything that the British had wanted for so long. The House of Commons, in which Nicolson sat, received the news very, very flatly. The loss of the Prince of Wales, the battleship Prince of Wales, he said, had numbed our nerves. The great rescue had, of course, arrived, but it didn't feel much like a rescue at the time. Okay, Greg, if you could move on to the second slide now. Thank you. So my second slide is Montgomery was awful, General Montgomery, but the right man for the job in August 1942. So we can see there are two gentlemen pictured there. The one on the left is General Claude Auchinleck, who I will come back to in a second. But probably the most famous is the gentleman on the right, Bernard Law Montgomery, who became the commander of the British 8th Army in North Africa in the summer of 1942, and then went on to lead British and Commonwealth troops in Tunisia, in Sicily, in Italy, and then in northwestern Europe, of course, after D-Day. Montgomery, Monty for short, was certainly one of the most divisive figures of Britain's Second World War. His admirers regard him as a general who turned the tide in the Western Desert and liberated northwestern Europe in 1944. His critics, many of them American, see him as insufferably vain and overcautious and dishonest about his mistakes. Both sides, I would suspect, are onto something. There's no question that Monty's ego was extraordinary, even by the standards of senior commanders. He was consistently unfair to his predecessors who had fought hard long before he arrived, men such as Auchinleck, for instance, who I'll come back to in a second. Monty was capable of some serious operational errors during the war. Operation Market Garden, perhaps being the most famous of these, the ill-fated attempt to liberate southern Holland and get Allied troops over the Rhine in September of 1944, and then refusing to acknowledge his mistakes. His relationships with American commanders were catastrophic. In particular, his kind of patronizing and belittling attitude towards General Eisenhower, which almost cost him his job at the end of 1944. Monty's job, I mean. The friction that Monty generated up and down the Allied command structure was a genuine strategic cost. And yet, when Montgomery took command of British Eighth Army in Egypt in the summer of 1942, something did indeed have to change. He may have been obnoxious, but he was probably the right man for the job at the time. Now, the man he was replacing was the gentleman there on the left, Claude Auchinleck, a relatively forgotten figure now, particularly, I think, in the United States, but in many ways, a much more impressive human being, and one that has probably been underestimated as a general as well. The Auk, as he was called, was tall, red-haired, with striking blue eyes, and had a sort of easy in-person charm, which Monty completely lacked. He was very smart, he was very self-effacing, and he had won an important battle at Crusader in December of 1941, which had prevented Rommel, General Erwin Rommel, the German commander of German and Italian forces, from breaking through to the Nile. Auchinleck had organized the first defensive stand against Rommel at El Alamein in July of 1942, which again arguably saved Egypt. He was also a very progressive voice within the Indian Army, which he was the commander-in-chief for long periods during the war. He worked to equalize pay between white and Indian officers. He was a genuinely decent man. But what he had failed to do was impose what is sometimes called grip on the Eighth Army. And that helped to explain some of the many disasters that had befallen it at the hands of Rommel up to the summer of 1942. The British Army in the desert was still a collection of pre-war formations rather than a unified fighting force, one in which cavalry, by which I mean, of course, mechanized cavalry, infantry, and artillery were working together as part of a coordinated whole rather than simply as separate parts. Many of Auchinleck's own commanders, divisional and corps commanders, followed orders with a kind of latitude that would not have been tolerated in the German army. They rather chose to decide which orders they would follow and which they wouldn't. Auchinleck seems to have been paralyzed by doubts about the quality of many of his own troops, doubts which were not wholly unjustified, but led to inaction rather than remedy. Now, Monty arrived on the scene at dawn on the 13th of August, 1942, and wasted no time in making himself completely unbearable. He cancelled all of Auchinleck's standing orders without even looking at them. He told Churchill, falsely, as he was later forced to admit after the war, that Auchinleck had been planning to retreat completely from El Alamein down the Nile and essentially abandon Egypt. And then Monty won a battle, the battle that's called Alam el Haifa, using precisely the same operational plan that Auchinleck had already prepared. The irony is almost perfect. Monty, in fact, was not actually Churchill's first choice. Churchill was not really personally a great fan of General Montgomery, and the man that he would have preferred to replace him was Lieutenant General Strafer Gott, who was, in many ways, again, a much more sort of likable, charming man, and a quite talented commander, but one who was probably tired and out of ideas, and thus not necessarily such a great choice as a replacement for Auchinleck. The issue became moot anyway, because on the 7th of August, 1942, Gott was traveling in a transport aircraft, which was shot down by German fighters, and so he was killed. What you really needed for Eighth Army in the summer of 1942 was an outsider, a man who had never served in the desert before, just as Montgomery had not, who would impose a new order on the troops there without regard for existing loyalties. Montgomery was that man. His character flaws were real. His generalship was often arguably very uneven. But in August 1942, in that specific place, his particular brand of overwhelming self-assurance was precisely what was needed. Sometimes history produces the right person, even if for the wrong reasons. Okay, Greg, if you could bring me on to number 3, please. Britain relied on foreign food while Germany didn't, and that was a good thing for the UK. Now, this might seem a little paradoxical or counterintuitive, so hopefully I can explain what I'm suggesting here. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Germany was largely autarkic or self-sufficient in food, while Britain most definitely was not. Britain imported roughly 2/3 of all of the calories that its population consumed in 1939. 2/3. As an island nation, which was about to be facing a ferocious submarine campaign, the U-boat campaign against its Atlantic supply lines, this sounds like an enormous, dangerous vulnerability. And it was certainly a source of some anxiety throughout the war, since at the height of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942 and early 1943, it did look, at least superficially, that Britain might be strangled into submission. But here is what this framing misses. That same dependence on imported food turned out to be a really important structural advantage that Britain had over Germany. Germany fed itself primarily from domestic production, food that was actually grown in Germany itself. Now, this sounds like strength, self-sufficiency, resilience, independence from having to worry about the sea lanes, but actually it was a weakness because domestic agriculture required a large workforce, and a large agricultural workforce is a workforce that cannot be working in your war factories. Britain, having committed to importing food across the previous century, ever since the Industrial Revolution, in fact, at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, Britain had relied upon imports of food from overseas, and instead, the bulk of its population had not been committed to agriculture, but to industry. And this meant that in 1939, a much higher proportion of the population in Britain was available for industry and military production than was the case in Germany. So just to sort of give you a rough idea about that, the German population at the beginning of the war was probably about twice as big as Britain's, about 80 million people to about 40 million in the UK. And yet their engineering sectors, in terms of the labor force, were about the same size. So in other words, Britain's was about twice as efficient as Germany's. And a lot of that has to do with that burden having to have such a high workforce, low productivity agricultural sector in Germany. And the British food system adapted itself to war with considerable intelligence. Yes, imports did fall overall, but not perhaps as many as might be expected. The majority of calories were still imported from overseas during the war. What tended to happen was the kind of food that was imported. So bulky, low-calorie produce, things like potatoes and root vegetables and cereals, the production of these was expanded within the UK itself, since it made no sense to use scarce shipping tonnage on things that you could grow in your own fields. What continued to arrive was high-calorie, protein-rich food, things like tinned and frozen meats and cheese and concentrated oils and fats. So the caloric density of imports increased even as the volume of imports fell. In fact, even at the peak of domestic farming output in Britain in 1944, more than half the calories consumed in Britain were still coming from abroad. The result was that the wartime British diet, despite all of the jokes about powdered egg and spam and so on, was actually remarkably nutritious, certainly by the country's historical standards. And this was expressed in some of the health statistics. So infant mortality fell during the war years, and most of the sort of health indicators for working class people improved. There was a rationing system, which could often be inconvenient and produced food that was, let's say, monotonous at times, but certainly nobody was going to starve. And it distributed food much more equitably than the market, the peacetime market had ever managed. Now, the lesson here is not that food vulnerability didn't matter. You did have to win the Battle of the Atlantic. You did have to make sure that the sea lanes remained open. But what it does show is that structural features that look like weaknesses can turn out to be strengths when circumstances change. Britain's food dependency is a classic example of this, of the way that Britain had gone through an earlier and much more thorough industrial transformation than Germany had undergone. And in a war economy, that was going to pay dividends. Okay, thank you, Greg. If we could move on to number 4. British area bombing and American precision bombing often weren't all that different in practice. Now, the strategic bombing of Germany throughout the Second World War is one of the most morally contested aspects of that war. And much of that, the reason for that is to do with the different strategies that were adopted, particularly the distinction between the strategy adopted by the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, of its bomber command, and that of the American Strategic Air Forces. On the one side, you had the RAF under Arthur Bomber Harris, conducting what was called explicit area bombing, the deliberate targeting of German cities to destroy housing and break civilian morale. Butcher Harris, as his critics sometimes call them. On the other hand, you had the United States Army Air Forces arriving, and of course, primarily, most famously, the 8th Army Air Force, arriving in the UK in 1942 with a different kind of doctrine, the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, surgical destruction of very specific industrial targets without the mass civilian killing that Harris's campaign involved. And I noticed that the recent TV show, Masters of the Air, made a great deal of the distinction between these two types of strategies, British area bombing and American precision bombing. The distinction has mattered enormously to how historians, perhaps on both sides of the Atlantic, have judged the air war. Harris would become a figure of great moral controversy. The Americans, by contrast, got to feel that they were doing something that was more morally discriminating, more defensible. The contrast between British area night bombing and precise American daylight attacks has become almost an axiom of post-war writing about the subject. The problem, though, as I would suggest, is that when you think about this in practice rather than in theory, the two doctrines were much less different than it's sometimes suggested. So we can start with this point with about geography. Railway marshalling yards, which were a primary American target under the so-called transportation plan to attack specific military targets, were generally located in the middle of German towns and cities. In other words, if you dropped bombs on a marshalling yard, inevitably you were going to hit an awful lot of housing that was around the railway structure. Now, conversely, some industrial facilities were also located within the center of German towns. So, for instance, coking plants that were producing benzol for Germany's fuel supply were often placed right, very close to workers' housing. And so, a World War II area bombing raid, which was supposedly simply targeting civilians, would often actually, in fact, hit industrial resources as well. Perhaps the most important point here is about accuracy. A World War II bombing raid, no matter who was doing it, was not a precision instrument, regardless of intent. And the physical consequences of area and precision attacks could often overlap enormously. The USAAF and its precision doctrine depended above all on being able to see the targets. But in Germany, or over Germany, clear visibility existed for perhaps 30 days out of 365 in the year, which meant that the famous Norden bomb sight, which you may have heard of, which was a remarkable piece of technology, able under ideal conditions to drop bombs very accurately, could not be used very often because the ideal conditions that were the kind of presupposition for it simply didn't exist. And so much of the rest of the time, what the Americans had to do was to rely on air-to-ground radar, a system that was called, the British called it H2S, the Americans called it H2X. It's pretty much the same system, however. This could more or less find a city under dense cloud, but certainly not a specific factory, which meant that if you were dropping bombs in this radar-assisted way, it was a much rougher and readier kind of approach. It's reckoned that of the bombs that American planes dropped on German synthetic oil plants, for instance, about half of them were aimed by radar, and of those, probably about 1 in 20 of the bombs landed within 1,000 yards of the aiming point. In other words, 19 out of 20 were landing somewhere else entirely. And you probably don't have to use a huge amount of imagination to think where else they might have been hit. By this measure, in fact, the RAF's nighttime accuracy against industrial targets was actually sometimes better than the American performance, simply because they had been flying for longer and they had more experience of this kind of thing. Now, whether or not the strategic bombing of Germany was right or wrong overall is a very complex question, which we don't need to make a snap judgment about right now. But the moral geography of the air war was far more complicated than a simple contrast between RAF quote-unquote brutality and American quote-unquote precision. Both air forces hit industrial targets. Both air forces killed civilians. The Americans probably killed fewer civilians per tons of bombs dropped, but that was simply because until the very final months of the war, they simply dropped fewer bombs, not because they were more accurate. The comfortable distinction between area and precision bombing was in large part a story that the Americans at the time told themselves. We, as historians, of course, don't have to accept this story quite so critically. Okay, having set the cat amongst the pigeons, perhaps, with that one, we'll move on to number 5, please, Greg. So here I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a bit less about the sort of military aspects of the war and more of the political consequences. My point 5 is Labour didn't win the general election in 1945 because of, quote unquote, the People's War. So let me very briefly explain what I'm talking about here. There were no general elections in the United Kingdom between the outbreak of war and July 1945. So a couple of months after Germany's surrender and shortly before the Japanese surrender. Winston Churchill had been prime minister throughout most of that period, but he wasn't elected in May of 1940. He was appointed by the king. And so the July 1945 election was the first time that he, as leader of the British Conservative Party, as well as being prime minister, had actually had to face the electorate directly. He does not win that election. In fact, his Conservative Party is decisively defeated in a landslide victory for the opposition, the main opposition party, the British Labour Party, which had up to this point been in coalition in the government with Churchill, but had now, as the war was coming to an end, normal party politics were resuming. Now, this is an iconic event in British 20th century history. Labour's landslide, Churchill ejected just a few weeks after having defeated the Germans, and his deputy during the war, Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, now forming a new government that would, in many ways, transform Britain over the next 6 years, creating the National Health Service and the modern welfare state. Now, this event has generated a near mythological kind of explanation in Britain. And the story goes, more or less, that the Second World War had been a quote-unquote people's war, in which there had been a fundamental transformation, political transformation of the electorate. The class distinctions in Britain had steadily eroded thanks to the war. Working people had demanded a fairer post-war world. They had read the famous Beveridge Report of November 1942, which proposed the creation of what we would basically think of as being a modern welfare state. They did not want to go back to the Depression era conditions of the 1930s. And there had been a broad shift of the population politically leftward, and that they voted accordingly in 1945. Now, like a lot of myths, of course, there is a kernel of truth to this. I'm not going to dispute that there is that all of this is kind of true. However, it can be significantly misleading. If you really get into it and actually try and figure out why did Labour do so well in 1945, I think the story can be actually quite different. For one thing, if you look at the arithmetic, Labour won about just under 2/3 of all of the seats in Parliament, but they actually received only about 48% of the popular vote. In other words, more people voted for non-Labour parties in 1945 than for Labour. The landslide was produced artificially in many ways by the first past the post system, the electoral system that's used in Britain, which magnified the relatively small popular advantage that that Labour had over the Conservatives. If you actually count all of the votes up, which we would think of as broadly left versus broadly right, you probably have something like 12 million votes for Labour and the left versus about just under 12 million for the Conservatives and the right. So a very, very, very slender majority, not much of a mandate for any fundamental transformation. And actually, if you look at what the issues that people cared about in 1945, and there was some work that was done about this at the time, it can be very revealing. There was a very detailed study that was done in the constituency of East Fulham in London, for instance, which was basically a working class constituency. And voters were asked, what was the most pressing issue for them? It wasn't employment, which came relatively low. It wasn't the welfare state. It wasn't health or the creation of a national health service. All of these were regarded as being very, very minor issues. The dominant issue was housing. And this is perhaps understandable when you think about the condition of housing in Britain at the end of the Second World War. Thanks to bombing, about 2 residences in every 7 had been destroyed or badly damaged during the war. And there had basically been virtually no new construction since 1939. 4 million demobilized men and women in the armed forces were about to come home from the battlefronts, looking for somewhere to live. And it turns out that Labour, the Labour Party, Clement Attlee's Labour Party, simply had more credibility on this issue. More of its candidates had served on local housing committees in local government in Britain during the war. They tended to have more experience with the housing issue. They could speak with more authority. Churchill, for all of his virtues as a war leader, didn't really have much experience of being a party leader. Certainly he had no experience of leading a political party in an election. And the Conservatives really struggled to figure out what their housing policy actually was, let alone how they should articulate it. So the real puzzle of 1945 isn't so much about why Attlee won. It's about why Churchill, who remained very personally popular, couldn't translate his personal popularity into votes for the Conservative Party. I think the answer is the British weren't so much eagerly voting for Labour as abandoning a government, Churchill's government, that they didn't trust anymore to be able to deal with what they regarded as simply being the most important pressing national issue once the war was over, which was, where are we going to live? And Churchill never really came up with a compelling answer. Okay, lastly, we'll one more point and then wrap this up, if you could put that up, Greg. Oh, so much we could say about this, but let me just give you a very, very brief version of this. Britain didn't lose the peace after 1945. This is arguably the most important corrective to the myth of everything I have to say. The one that cuts against the dominant tone of much writing about the Second World War in Britain. So the standard account of the British experience in the war is that the British won the war but lost the peace. This account is an elegiac one of decline and defeat. Now, there is no question that winning the war was in many ways incredibly costly for Great Britain. and its empire. The war cost Britain roughly 1/5 of its national wealth. Its merchant shipping, its merchant marine was a third smaller at the end of the war than it had been in 1939. Britain had accumulated about £4 billion at then prices of external debt. 2/5 of its overseas business assets were gone, liquidated by the end of the war. Exports were at less than half their pre-war value. And as far as the empire was concerned, within 5 years of the war ending, most of the empire, much of the empire at least, east of Suez, was in rapid retreat. India, Pakistan, Burma, Sri Lanka, all of these had gone, declared independence. Churchill himself, surveying the scene from the House of Commons in 1951, described the post-war years as marking the greatest fall in Britain's rank and stature since the loss of the American colonies. And this is all real. The loss of empire, the retreat from great power status, these things happened and they did matter. And yet, by the 1950s, Britain was at the start of the longest sustained period of economic growth in its history. It wasn't bankrupted by the war, as is often claimed. It did suffer some short-term dollar liquidity problems. But once these had been resolved after 1949 and 1950, Britain was only not bankrupt, but found itself well positioned to benefit from an extraordinarily favorable world trade climate. So rationing ended in the early 1950s, prosperity returned and kept coming. The UK grew at an average annual rate of 2 to 3% GDP from the late 1940s to the early 1970s. And that was consistently better than anything that it had ever seen before the war. So its real GDP ended up more or less doubling. Unemployment remained low, wages outpaced inflation. And this is the most important. The lives of ordinary British people were transformed for the better after World War II. The welfare state delivered healthcare, education, pensions, and housing to people who'd never had reliable access to them. People like my family, which were working class. Luxuries that in 1939 had been generally available only to much wealthier people, things like a family home, a car, foreign holidays, a university education, became commonplace for manual workers and their children. One example would be my own parents, both of whom had left school at 15, and yet of their children all ended up not just going to university, but eventually acquiring graduate degrees. By almost any measure of human welfare, Britain after World War II was a vastly better place to live in for most of its people than Britain in 1939 had been. Yes, the empire had gone, but frankly, was not everybody sort of quietly relieved that the empire had gone anyway? The British people didn't lose the peace, they won it. And that distinction between the fate of great powers and the fate of ordinary citizens is, I think, an underappreciated one, but one of the most important, most frequently obscured truths about the history of the 20th century. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. That was fantastic. I don't even have to read the Q&A. We've already got a number in the queue. Okay, we have a lot in the queue.
Okay. Well, I'm not in any great hurry, so we'll just.
I'm gonna read two from the chat, and then I'll go Mark, Alex, Mike, Brandon, Jim. Okay, from the chat, Evan asked, wasn't the HMS Prince of Wales the ship that was with the hood when it was sunk by Bismarck?
It was, yes. The Prince of Wales was one of the most advanced battleships that Britain possessed in 1941. It was one of the King George V class. It had been at the famous battle that your audience member is referring to when the Bismarck had sunk the hood. It was also the battleship that Churchill traveled upon to go and meet Roosevelt for the first time at Placentia Bay in Newfoundland in the summer of 1941. So there's a particular poignancy about that. You see the scenes of Churchill and FDR on the deck of HMS Prince of Wales, and yet less than half a year later, she would be at the bottom of the sea. Excuse me, at the bottom of the sea, just off the coast of Malaya.
Next, anonymous, two questions. What were the ideal conditions for the use of the Norden bomb site? You can answer that as briefly as you like. And I know Robert McNamara was part of the group that made in-depth analysis of what were the best bombing targets. Was this of any benefit, or did it make a difference?
Yeah, the answer to the first part's very easy. The kind of day that we're having today, I think, which is cloudless, lovely blue skies. A lot of the training for using the Norden was done in places like Arizona and New Mexico, which are have delightful weather, I'm sure, for much of the year. But one of the disadvantages of doing the training there was that you got to, Northwestern Europe has many qualities, but cloudless days are not one of them. You might be lucky out of 1 out of 10 days where you've got clouds. And the fact is that if you're traveling at 18 or 20,000 feet and looking down, if you can't see what's below you, then this ingenious device isn't going to be much use because it relies on being able to see things. So that's why they didn't use it, not nearly as much as I think that they'd expected to. About McNamara, there's a great documentary called The Fog of War, which I recommend to anyone, if which is about lots of other things, about his career as the Secretary of Defense and so on. But he does talk at some length about his World War II experiences. He was a statistician with the USAAF, and he was involved in sort of doing operational research, both for the European campaign and then particularly for the Pacific campaign. He is one of the men who made the kind of notorious argument, if you like, that that the USAAF should switch to firebombing of German cities, because he argued from the statistics that this would be much more effective. So it is a fascinating story, and he does seem to play a significant role.
Excellent. Okay, we'll go to the live audience. Mark, you're up, and you should be able to unmute your line.
Yeah, very, very good. Thank you, Greg, and thank you for this presentation. My question goes back to, I think it's slide 3, on Montgomery.
Right.
So, in reading Alan Brooks' diaries, he pretty much fawns on Montgomery. It's almost to the effect that he eventually does realize that he's no diplomat, but can you explain why Alan Brooke liked Montgomery so much, even despite the disaster with Market Garden?
Well, yeah. So let me first of all just briefly explain who we're talking about here. So this is General Alan Brooke, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff throughout most of the war. So was basically Churchill's senior military advisor. I do recommend, by the way, if anyone is interested, that Alan Brooke kept a very, very detailed diary throughout the war, which Mark was just alluding to here, and it is a wonderful read. He found his relationship with Churchill was an extraordinarily kind of tempestuous one, which was sort of half hero worship and half hatred. And he sort of, I think at one point he said, I've never admired and detested a man quite so much. Montgomery was his protege, Alan Brooke's protege. They had both been together at the Staff College, which is sort of the equivalent, kind of like West Point or the Army War College, in the 1930s. And Brooke was a little bit older than Montgomery, a little more senior, and he had sort of taken him under his wing. I think that what Brooke recognized was that Montgomery had some serious personal issues and was not liked within the army at all. But I think that he recognized some kind of quality about him, of seriousness, which I think was always one of Alan Brooke's complaints, which was that the British Army put too much emphasis on character and not enough on brains. That it sort of tended to promote men who were like very charming and nice to work with, but not always very smart. And Montgomery was different in that regard. And so when Strafe-Forgot was killed in August 1942, Brooke took the opportunity of saying, look, let's try out Montgomery. Churchill was not very keen. I say was never a big Monty fan. Didn't care for him personally much at all. I think you could. I mean, we could talk a great deal about this. One could make the argument, I think, that generally speaking, the results certainly in 1942, 1943, and maybe the first half of 1944 as well, generally worked to their advantage. Montgomery had a particular kind of approach to fighting the war, which I think had its defects, but also fitted quite well with the qualities of the British Army, the British Commonwealth Army. Market Garden is definitely a black mark on his record. I think it was a disastrous plan, very out of character in lots of different ways. It did come I'm sorry.
Oh, so yeah, very much so, because he was so much the planner.
Yes,
and
exactly.
like Al Alamein, he stocked up all this weaponry and then hit when it was best. Whereas Market Garden was a real roll of the dice with a lot of risks.
It was completely out of character, and I think the best explanation I have for it is that I think that Montgomery was under pressure to try and bring the war to an end by the end of 1944. I talk about this in my new book a bit, which is that Britain was completely tapped out at this point. You have to remember, it's completely mobilized. It very desperately needed the war to come to an end as soon as possible. And I think that Monty had, a lot of people sort of breathing down his neck saying, you've got to try and get this war over in the next few months. And I think that was, Market Garden was that sort of roll of the dice, as you put it, an attempt to try and capitalize on the German defeat in the summer of 1944 and see whether enough momentum had been built up to get over the Rhine. It didn't work. I don't think it was ever going to work. And he was not the right man to lead it anyway, but I can sort of understand why they tried to do it at the time. I think it had a lot more to do with sort of grand strategy and politics than really the military situation.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
Yeah, Alex, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and thanks, Alan, for a good presentation. I want to ask two, rather different question. The first one is, since you've done such, extensive study of, Britain in the war and obviously Churchill, I was concerned, with the research you've done, what's your perspective now on the whole issue of, Churchill's, soft underbelly of Europe strategy, and whether that was ever viable or just, that the strategy that was ultimately followed was, through invading through France, advancing through Western Europe was the good one. And the second one is, more of a political economic question, which is, the traditional perspective on, why Labor, won the 45 election is that the British people essentially felt that, they had been, promised a better life after the war, and that, Labor was going to deliver that with, the welfare state. So,
Right.
So I just wonder if you found that argument to be convincing, or if you have, having done all this research, you have a different perspective now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so there's two questions there. So the first one was about the Mediterranean strategy, aka the soft underbelly strategy. Well, again, this is one that I talk about at some length in the book. So I'll just a very, very brief version of this is that the people like George Marshall famously wanted to try and launch a cross-channel invasion as soon as possible. I mean, he ideally would have liked to have done it in 1942. And then argued strongly for the idea of doing it in 1943. I actually don't think it was ever realistic, and regardless of what somebody like Churchill might have thought. And the reason for that was simply, in order to create the preconditions for this to ever succeed, a couple of things were going to have to be true. One thing was that you were going to have to defeat the U-boat menace, the submarine menace. And that because you're going to need an ability to be able to bring over all of the troops and supplies from the United States. That didn't happen until the second half of 1943. So before then, it was complete debt. It was not going to happen. The second problem was that before you could start the war in Northwest Europe, you had to bring the war in North Africa to an end. And Hitler doubled down on that in the beginning of 1943. When, after Operation Torch, when the Allies invaded French North Africa, Hitler could basically have given up on North Africa at that point, and probably would have been the wise thing to do. Instead, he sent a whole new Panzer army there, which meant that it was going to take the best part of 6 months to defeat the German and Italian forces in North Africa. Now, in the long run, I think that was a sheer waste of German manpower. However, what it probably did do was mean that you could not turn around and then, having defeated the Germans in North Africa, then turn around and go and try a D-Day offensive in 1943. Because remember, by the time you get to sort of late September, October, you were not going to be able to do a cross-channel invasion. The weather just wasn't good enough anymore. So I think that most of this was going to happen. I think that Churchill was a bit unrealistic about the possibilities of the Mediterranean campaign. I think he got more unrealistic about it as time went on, and I think that that's one of the weaker elements of his strategy making, was that he became sort of increasingly sort of obsessed with this idea that there was some great opportunity in Italy. I don't actually think there was. I think that this was in the end it was a sort of cul-de-sac. Very briefly, but the other point then about politics, as I sort of alluded to, I think in my point, I'm less convinced than other historians have ever been that the 1945 election represented, a fundamental sort of sea change in the political character of the nation or anything like that. I think a lot of people were just fed up in 1945. They were fed up with being ordered around, marched about, told what to do, and they wanted to lash out. And as is so often the case, the people that they lash out at are the government of the time, which happened to be Churchill's government that was dominated by the Conservative Party. The beneficiaries of that were the Labour Party, although ironically the Labour Party was actually in coalition with Churchill's Conservatives. But I don't think they were perceived as being the government per se. I think Churchill was. And while I did say, Churchill personally remained a very popular figure, but the Conservative brand was badly tarnished by 1945, which meant that even for all his own personality, his own popularity, he was not going to be able to overcome the fact that people were just tired of the Conservatives. It wouldn't last. They were going to elect them back into office in 1951, but at that particular moment, they wanted them out. So I hope that very briefly answers some of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Alex. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes. First of all, excellent talk. And I agree with most of what you said, except for
most. There's a very ominous word there. Okay.
Well, that's where the questions come in. Well, at least one of them, which was on the bombing campaign, because of the research that I've done. Said, well, first of all, one thing I know is that you did not need ideal conditions to use the northern bomb sites.
No.
That's preferable, but you could get reasonably good accuracy even with non-ideal conditions. Otherwise, as you said, there would have been only 30 daylight precision bombing raids during any given year, and there were far more than that. Also, because the aiming point was not necessarily what they had to hit. They had to hit the target area. A good example of that, which was first Schweinfurt, or both Schweinfurt raids, but especially the first Schweinfurt raid, which was far more successful than has been given credit for in recent times. They had to hit the target area. There were 4 factories in the area. There were marshalling yards. There were many different targets within the area. And the British were supposed to come in that night, but they had a slightly more high priority target to hit, which had to do with the German rocket industry. But the fact is, so wouldn't you say though that all in all, it was the precision bombing, which by the way, the RAF did have precision raids, not nearly.
That's true.
But the precision bombing in the daylight precision bombing was essential with, in other words, as Churchill called the round-the-clock bombing, but not for that reason, that they worked in tandem, in concert with each other, and that both were important for the vitally important part that the bombing of German industry played. So that would be that one question. The second question.
Answer that one before, otherwise we could be here all day. So I mean, I would broadly agree with much of what you just said there. All I would say is, remember that, of course, when you say target areas, well, there is the point, perhaps, which is that we are starting to deal with areas rather than sort of the way in which precision targets had been traditionally assigned. I won't. I'm going to. Hopefully, this doesn't seem like I'm sort of diverting, but I will say that I think I do broadly take much of what your point of what you just said. I would say the really decisive thing that the Americans did actually in the bombing war was counterforce strategy. In other words, actually realizing at the beginning of 1944 that what they had to do was to defeat the German Air Force in the air, and that the use of long-range, very effective fighter escorts like the P-47 and then eventually the P-51. This was fundamentally a turning point in the war, and Carl Spaatz in particular deserves a huge amount of credit for that. And I think it was that insight. The British had kind of ignored this problem for a long time, and it has to be said, even the Americans had ignored it for a while. But that insight that once you destroy the German Air Force in the air, then you can attempt all kinds of different bombing at that point. You can attempt area raids, you can attempt precision raids, and that was sort of the watershed moment. And I think that is sort of created then that sort of momentum which transformed things for both the Americans and the British in 1944. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, but I thought we would do
No. I would also add that the bombing German industry also affected fighter production.
Yes, sure.
Fighter production went up. It didn't go up before D-Day, number one. Number two, the quality of fighters, it didn't go up nearly as much as the Germans had intended, and the quality of fighter aircraft had gone down. Also, they weren't producing bomber aircraft. But right. Anyway, the second question, hold it, let me just get rid of some extant noise there. The second question has to do with what you considered the more, well, actually, it's an overall thing. I mean, first of all, I would wonder if the one significant thing that came out of the war was a reduction, if not destruction, of the British class system that had existed before the war. And if that wasn't significant in the, shall we say, dispersal of jobs and opportunities and actual materials to the population as a whole. And also, would you say that in general, the Americans the British represented, shall we say, a counterpoint or a corrective to American impetuousness during the war. So they presented the more rational, having been in the war for substantially longer, a more rational approach to, let's say, the Americans' over-aggressiveness during the war. That's really two questions in there. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. All right, very briefly then. I take your point to some degree about the class system, although I actually think that the class system was less effective than sometimes people argue as a result of the war. I think the one thing that changed was class deference. It's not so much that people stopped being working class, but they stopped being embarrassed about being working class in a way that they had been before the war. And the kind of tug of the forelock, if you like, towards their social betters is one thing that is sort of destroyed by the war. And that obviously has implications for society and politics and so on. As far as the second point goes, I would, heaven forfend that I should use anything quite as loaded as impetuous or rational or anything like that. What I would say is, though, that I think that when you can think about the way that George Marshall thought about the problem, the grand strategic problem in 1942, of course, he had a point that, the shortest way to get to Berlin was to land an army somewhere in northern France or the Low Countries and march it as quickly as you possibly could. It's a geometrical issue. And of course, there was a strong tradition in the US military, going back to the Civil War and so on, for thinking about these very straightforward kind of offensive explanation, theories about how to deal with the enemy. Britain's, of course, experience had been very different because they had fought the Germans on the continent in 1940 and lost, and they had fought the Germans in the Western Desert and in North Africa from 1941 through 1942, and had had a very uneven kind of success rate. And depending on your point of view, you could either say that made them overly timid about the prospect of fighting in Europe, or that it gave them a kind of sensible amount of caution and hesitancy about all of this. I think that it weighed very heavily on the minds of people like Allport in 1941 and 1942, that the Germans were no pushovers, that they had been ferociously successful against all of the Allied armies, including, of course, the Soviet Union as well, and that it was going to take a good deal of softening up of the German military before a successful cross-channel invasion was really possible. And of course, you could argue that, you know, even with all of the advantages that the Allies had by June 1944, the Normandy campaign was still a heck of a difficult campaign. It was still a real bloody slog through that bocage. And so, you know, you can see why maybe delaying, maybe, you know, not attacking until you were absolutely sure that you had overwhelming force, perhaps turned it out to be the best thing to do. Very good questions, though.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Alan, how are you for time? Because
I'm okay. We can do a couple more if you want.
Okay, we do have more than a couple more. Okay, Brandon, why don't you unmute your line and ask your question?
Hi, you can hear me, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Right. I'm sure you came across the term unhousing.
Dehousing.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Right, of course. And I just think that makes your entire argument about the differences. I mean, basically, the United States, when push came to shove, you killed the people who were in the factory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the people in the factories might have been French. They might have been Russian prisoners of war, whatever. We really weren't that far different. And I think it's pretty well established after the war that the Germans ran out of pilots and petrol, not planes. So I just want to make that comment. I want to ask you a real quick question, which is that, you know, Pearl Harbor wasn't determined, you know, the Americans didn't determine when Pearl Harbor was, right? So it was bad for the Americans too. It was bad for all of the Allies, obviously. The Japanese had their 6 months. So, I mean, I don't see where the temporal nature there matter. I mean, the British Empire was going to, they had the guns pointing the wrong way at Singapore anyway, for the way the Japanese actually came. And that was supposed to be the linchpin of the defense of the Far East. So things just weren't going to go well there, no matter really when it happened. And so I'm kind of siding with Churchill here in the sense that he should have been relieved.
Let me say one thing. It's not actually true that the guns were pointing in the wrong direction at Singapore. This is a story that's often said. The guns that were in the fortress of Singapore could actually be pointed landward as well as seaward. The problem was that they all had armor-piercing shells, which were very good for being able to kind of attack Japanese battleships, but not very much use against land forces. So I think, no, but to get to the real thrust of your point here. So Churchill's view about the Far East, as it would have been called at the time, was that, first of all, he didn't think that the Japanese would attack Singapore. And second, if they did attack Singapore, it would probably take at least 6 months to a year to actually take the fortress. And third of all, is that if they did attack Singapore and take the fortress, then the Americans would get involved in the war, and all calculations would be kind of thrown out the window anyway, because it would be a completely different war. Now, he was wrong about the first two of those assumptions. The Japanese did attack, and it actually turned out to be much easier for them than anybody, including the Japanese themselves, had anticipated. However, of course, he was right about the third point, which is that it would bring the United States into the war. And you could argue then that from that point of view, he was right about the most important thing that mattered, which is that it was going to transform things. Really, the only real point that I was trying to make about all here was that Churchill's grand strategy, ever since he became prime minister in May of 1940, had been try to get the Americans into the war. Now, Pearl Harbor was the sort of trigger that actually accomplished this in the end. However, of all of the triggers that might have been possible, it's definitely not the one that he would have chosen. Because while, you know, in the big sense, of course, it mattered hugely, it also meant that there was now a completely new war that both the United States and the British Commonwealth were going to have to fight, distracting from what Churchill always regarded, of course, as being the main event, which was the war against Germany. So, yes, the outcome was good, but it was definitely not the process that Churchill would have ideally liked to see. And as I was suggesting when it came to things like Lend-Lease, what it meant is that at least in the short term, there would be huge complications to the British war effort in Europe, because it meant that now they were no longer necessarily the sole consideration, that the Americans were going to start, as they did, sending materials to the Pacific and storing up materials for themselves in order to be able to conduct their own operations in Europe. It was not at all clear in the few days after Pearl Harbor whether Lend-Lease was even going to continue or not, or whether the Americans would just sort of wrap it up and say, well, we're back to the way things used to be. So this was a sort of complication which I don't think is always sort of sufficiently emphasized in the histories, and that's really just the point I wanted to make.
Okay, and then of course, Liberty ships became a British design. That did help. What can I just make one more quick observation, which is in agreement with your point, which is just this whole thing about the agriculture. The Germans treated their allies terribly throughout the war,
yes,
and that hurt them badly in the long run. And so I think Britain's dependence on other places and people, which had also been true in the First World War, of course, made their alliance work, made their attitudes good in terms of fighting the kind of world war that they had.
One of the things that Richard Overy has a very good book called How the Allies Won. One of the main arguments he makes in that book is that the Allies had a true alliance. In other words, for all of its weaknesses, and there were kind of tensions and weaknesses within it, but it generally worked. People that talked to one another, they planned with one another, and they trusted one another, even with the Soviet Union, which was a very difficult relationship. The Axis never had anything remotely similar to that. They didn't talk, they didn't plan, and they didn't trust. The Germans found out about Pearl Harbor the same way everybody else did, by listening to the news on the radio. They had no idea what was coming, which was sort of exemplified in many ways the total lack of any kind of a grand strategy that existed on that side. Talking to your allies and trusting your allies really helps in a big war.
Thanks. Good talk.
Yep. Thanks. And then Jim, we'll close out with you. Apologize to the others. Time is just limited resource. Jim, if you want to unmute your line.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
All right, thank you. Yeah, all your propositions, we could argue about some of those for hours. But my questions are two. First of all, how do you see the whole idea that some historians argue that the British had at the grand strategy level, that they were anticipating perhaps a collapse of Germany, similar to what happened in the summer of 1918 into the fall of 1918. And hence you had the creation of the Rankin A, B, and C plans, which were based on the assumption that they would not face a hostile landing, but would be coming in to essentially deal with a shattered and surrendering German army. And that gets into the question of the Eastern Front. Now, so that would be question number one. Question number two is, earlier when you were talking about the election of 45, and you mentioned the study by Lord Beveridge in earlier in the war, it raises the question of what were people in England envisioning would be the social policy payoff after the war, such as the creation of the NHS or the welfare programs. And that, of course, was not a English phenomena. We see that in Ezer Wollock's book about the post-war period in France, in the United States and England, where people were arguing this. In the United States, of course, the Republican Party had control of Congress, and there was this huge debate about having a full employment addition to the Constitution, which was defeated. But nevertheless, these are, and the New Deal was also, now, of course, we're seeing the New Deal being dismantled right and left. But these were issues that were very much prevalent. So I'm just curious, from a cross-cultural and historical point of view, how do you place what happens in England and the drive to sort of have that social reform impetus in the context of other societies coming out of the Second World War?
Okay, great questions. All right, very briefly then. So the first one was, about
Rankin A, B, and C, and then the Eastern Front issue.
Yeah. So I think one of the big errors that you could say with British grand strategy, and it had been British and French grand strategy, starting in 1939 and would continue for a long time, was the idea that Hitler was a weak and unpopular figure in Germany, that the Nazis were, did not have the broad support of the German people, that they were basically a kind of very brittle, fragile kind of, group a clique, and that there was this enormous reserve of kind of resentment and opposition, both in Germany and then also later in the occupied countries of Europe. And so there was the idea that through as much psychological as material ways, through propaganda, through the blockade, cutting off food supplies, by bombing, the morale effects of bombing, that you might have some kind of political revolution in Germany. Maybe Hitler would be assassinated by one of his generals or by one of the other members of the Nazi party, or maybe that there would be mass uprisings within France or other occupied countries, or maybe that there would be a revolution in Germany in the same way that there had been in November 1918. Now, as it turned out, none of this was actually true. There were no popular uprisings. I mean, yes, the role of the resistance is important and a very courageous one, but fundamentally, it's a sidebar to the main story. And as for Germany, of course, the Germans ultimately fought until April 1945, the beginning of May 1945, literally, in Berlin, street by street, building by building, and did not surrender until the Russians were literally flying the hammer and sickle from the Reichstag building. There was no revolution. There was no repeat of 1918, and I think it was a great misunderstanding about the popularity of the Nazi Party. So the other one was about what people in Britain wanted.
People will argue that here's a moment historically where people were trying to integrate what the lessons were of the 20s and 30s and the Depression, creating social reform, and that was not just unique with England. It was something throughout.
So one very brief answer then would be, I think that throughout much of the war, the assumption had been in Britain that what would happen after the war would be a repeat of what had happened immediately after the First World War, which is that there would be an economic depression, that there would be a huge slump. This isn't so much thinking about the depression of the 30s. I mean, immediately after the war, and this was certainly true in Britain, that there had been a huge economic decline as industry had become demobilized, and there would be mass unemployment. And so much of the political conversation that took place in 1942, 43, 1944 was about that expected collapse and how would you deal with that? And that's part of the reason why people were arguing for a welfare state, because you were going to need a lot of unemployment benefit because people were going to be out of work. What I think had not been anticipated, and this speaks to your point about the broad kind of the global story here, is that nobody had realized that the kind of institutions that were going to be introduced at the end of the war, things like the Bretton Woods, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Bank, the IMF, things like this, and the collapse of tariff walls throughout the world, we're going to create a new kind of economic environment where there was going to be massive global growth. If you look at those years, 30 odd years after World War II, it's the fastest economic growth in the world that the world has ever seen. And this was going to create massive prosperity, not just amongst the Allied countries, of course, but everywhere, including even the defeated countries like Germany and Japan. And so there were going to be problems that were going to be associated with this, things like inflation and so on. But people hadn't anticipated that these were going to be the problems. They thought they were going to be mass unemployment was going to be the great problem in the 50s and 60s, which of course turned out not to be the case at all. So everyone, in a sense, was planning for the wrong end, a wrong post-war, a different kind of war that post-war world that actually resulted. Right. Well, great question.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. On that note, we'll conclude our lecture for today. Again, the book is Advanced Britannia, The Epic Story of the Second World War, 1942 by 1945 by Alan Allport. Alan, we definitely need to have you back in the fall.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, Britain at Bay. And I should have done that in my intro. That's volume 1. I think people probably figured that out from the title, but would love to have you back. Great talk. Okay, next week we've got Craig Luther on his book Operation Barbarossa. He will be talking for 2 weeks because last time he went for 3.5 hours. So
He's more stamina than me.
Yeah, and that was even actually I think he could have gone longer, but his wife intervened. Anyway, thank you so much, Alan. As I said, we'll have this talk probably some point during the Knicks game this evening online. And yeah, great talk. We'd love to have you back, and thanks for the audience for joining. See you next week. Take care.
Thank you.